Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel on issues in higher education, access to higher education, and gender. My name is Manjeet Ramgotra, and I am a senior lecturer in political theory at SOAS, University of London, and I am a great advocate of decolonizing the curriculum. I'm really excited to be chairing this panel as we have an excellent set of speakers who will explore issues related to decolonizing higher education in Commonwealth countries. This includes addressing not only the lack of diversity in university curricula, but also issues of access to higher education, especially for students of less privileged and marginalized backgrounds, which often become manifest in the attainment gap and feelings of estrangement upon arriving at university. We will also discuss issues of the marketization of higher education, where the opening of universities to the wider participation of less privileged students in the UK has been accompanied by the massive increase in fees. In South Africa, fees have also been an issue. For instance, the fees must fall movement has been both strong and volatile, especially at WITS, the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and one of our speakers is from WITS, and I hope that he will touch on this topic. As universities are being transformed through their commercialization, students are demanding greater diversity in their learning and more spaces for them to feel comfortable and integrated in institutions that in the past have excluded on the basis of gender, race, and class. Many students want to feel included in the processes of their learning and call for a curriculum that reflects their histories and who they are, rather than one that replicates systems of knowledge produced by a small portion of society, which very often reproduces the inequalities that higher education is meant to address and eliminate. So we are at a fruitful and interesting moment in higher education, where university structures and knowledge, including what we learn and how we learn, are being debated and reimagined. So let me quickly introduce and turn over to our three speakers. Here in the room, we have Sunder Katwala, who is the director of British Future, which is, I believe, a research center or a think tank that focuses on people's hopes and fears about integration and immigration, identity, and race. He's a well-known public intellectual and used to be the Secretary General of the Fabian Society. And online, I hope you've been able to join us online already. I didn't check with IT. Is everything? Yep, that's all great. So, and please forgive me if I mispronounce your names. We have Rekgotsofetse Chikane, who is lecturer at the School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. He is an activist and was a leading figure in the Rhodes Must Fall movement. He has written about the role of young people in redynamizing the politics of South Africa in his book called Breaking a Rainbow, Building a Nation, The Politics Behind #MustFall. Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce Elaine Unterhalter, who is a professor of education and international development at the UCL Institute of Education. She is a fellow of the British Academy, and her work on education, gender, and development focuses on inequalities in the educational sector and compares practices and policies across different educational systems. So I'm very pleased to turn over to Sunder, and each speaker will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes. I know we're going over a little bit over time, but I hope that's all right.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. I'm the director of British Future, which is a charity and think tank. We're interested in how this country, Britain, can be an inclusive, welcoming and confident country, but we think that means you have to work out where the hopes and anxieties are of the country at a time of fast change are about some of the issues that are divisive and polarising sometimes, such as race, immigration and identity, and that's what we're doing. And obviously those debates happen nationally and internationally at the same time. Personally, I was born in Britain to parents from India and Ireland. India did join the Commonwealth. Ireland didn't, because when Ireland was getting its independence, you couldn't be a republic and stay in the Commonwealth. And when India was getting its independence, they decided you could, and then there wouldn't be a Commonwealth, or there wouldn't be a very big Commonwealth if they hadn't made that choice. So for me personally, the issue of who do we think we are and how is the history related was a very obvious question when I was 14. But those questions play out differently, I think, in the different countries of the Commonwealth. Why does higher education matter as a space for debate? Everybody else in the room, I think, knows more about higher education than I do at the moment as professionals and specialists and recent students. But the two places that debates about change happen most intensely, and they are the internet and the universities. And that is because universities are places of thought leadership, and they're also places where generational change happens and comes through. And I think that's interesting. And then that also happens on the internet. And so what is happening in South Africa and in Britain and in America get connected up. And, these might be distinct national debates or perspectives, or they might be international debates. All debates are international these days. But also higher education is a place of opportunity. If you get to go and you do well and you get the chances. But it's also a place of exclusion, either there or if you don't get to go, actually, because doing well in our societies these days is much harder if you don't have a graduate degree. And so, actually, if you look at some of the political debates happening in democracies, they are debates across the generations, against social class, against people living in different places. Often they come down to being debates about how the world looks differently if you've got a degree or if you haven't. If you're a younger or older person with a degree, without a degree. And so the Brexit debate in Britain was about that. I think a lot of what's happening in Donald Trump's America is about that. That's playing out in different ways. So higher education is also the sort of fulcrum of these quite polarised debates about, say, free speech and hate speech, and what one generation thought the balance was and what the next generation thinks it was. And professors and academics are navigating that debate and how we make that work. What does that mean for the debate about an inclusive history? I'm very in favour of seeing an inclusive history that tells all of the stories and gives a more balanced share of voice to all of the stories, and I want that to appeal quite strongly. Others will say more about this, I'm sure, in this discussion. I'm not sure if I call that decolonisation, because decolonisation means so many different things, so many different people. I think it probably means something different in Britain and in South Africa and in India. It's clearly the process of the end of empire, literally, and the taking down of flags, symbolic moments. Is it the right word to use about changing curriculums, diversifying authorship, having proper equality and diversity in the staff room, and so on? If it means lots of different things, people will think different things about it. I'm somewhat more in favour of having a tell everybody stories, keep the sharp edges in argument, and then talk about how to do that. Whereas I think when people hear the word decolonisation, they think that we've got an image of one very strong monolithic argument and that we're going to replace it with an equally monolithic argument, which is probably not the intentions. I've been talking to a lot of people doing inclusive history, engaging with navigating culture wars, asking them what they think about this language. The thing that people most often say to me is, it's really important to do this work. I'm not massively invested in what we call it or what we don't call it. And then other people have very strong views about what to call it and what not to call it. So I'm interested in how we protect the work and broaden the audience for the work. I don't think you put diverse authors onto the curriculum because some of us have parents from India. I think you put diverse authors onto the curriculum because we're all sharing a society or Commonwealth in a world where you need to hear a balance of all of the voices. So I'm interested in what Britain does with its history, what Birmingham does with its history, what other countries that were involved with Britain talk to us about what we're doing with our history and what they're doing with our shared history of post-empire. In a way, I'm interested in bringing the empire back in as much as taking it out. I mean, if your parents happen to be from India and Ireland, you can't understand why you're British without understanding the story of empire, but you don't have to have parents from the Commonwealth if you live in London or Bristol or Liverpool or Glasgow. Everybody in those places has been shaped by the Commonwealth, just as is the case for any of the other places that the empire was part of and that shrank away. So how are we going to tell that story well in a way that involves everybody and everybody feels a sense of voice in? I think we can make great use of the history of how we became the country we are. I think we've got to use moments like the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. Something that happened last week was that the government put up a national monument in Waterloo Station to the Windrush generation. And the story of the Windrush, you can't now tell the story of immigration to Britain without talking about the Windrush. It wasn't the first ship to arrive in the post-war era. There were a couple in 1947 as well, in Liverpool and Southampton. But the Nationality Act was being passed in 1948, saying that everybody had an equal status in Britain if they were from the Empire and the colonies. So some people pay £28 to get on a boat because they believe that to be true. They've been taught that in school. And so there's a shock that's captured in the novel Small Island. If you have been told a story about your non-negotiable British identity and you arrive in a country that doesn't know the story you've been told about it, the story of the Windrush generation is a very interesting, important, foundational story. We talk about it as the start of three-quarters of a century of this version of Britain, but it's actually the middle of a 4-century-old story about empire, slavery, abolition, and so on. So we need to know that story and own that story. And it's the 75th anniversary next year of the Windrush, and I think we need to do something different with it than was done with, say, the 25th anniversary when people were debating Enoch Powell's call for everybody to be repatriated, or the 50th anniversary, which actually put this in the national consciousness for the first time. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity to use things like anniversaries, things like sporting events, to invite everybody to be part of those conversations and keep all of the sharp edges in. But maybe to start with an invitation that is a bit less challenging and conflict-based than decolonisation is seen to her, but I think other people will probably put the opposite side of that argument.
Wonderful, thank you very much. I would now like to, there's lots of food for thought there. So I'd like to invite our colleague at WITS, Rekgotsofetse. Sorry, I cannot pronounce your name. I'm very sorry.
It is perfectly fine.
Hi. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Rekgotsofetse, and it is a mouthful even for South Africans as well. But the story of my name is really that it means we are satisfied. It's my mom's political statement to essentially say to her mother-in-law at the time, I'm not having any more kids. Like, I'm done. Like, I've had 3 children, and it's a political statement that I'm making. And what's interesting about the name is that it got shortened once upon a time in about the 2nd grade. And it got made into Khotli, which, for all intents and purposes, is a random collection of letters that seem to make a sound called Khotli, that seems to have like this tangential link to my fuller name. And I went with that because I went to a school that preached diversity, unity, of being accommodating to individuals and bringing people together. And I thought, I am doing my part to build the rainbow nation in the country. And then I decided not to do that exercise. And I decided that, no, you should use my name. Because if you don't use my full name, if you shorten it into these random collection of letters, you completely erase the story of my mom's political statements, right? It's a moment of truly not just understanding what your identity is, but be willing to unapologetically advocate for it. So when we think about decolonization in the country, and I'm not a spokesperson for everyone, what made 2015 quite different? 2015 was the emergence of Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall, 2 distinct organizations, but with very fundamental pillars. And the decision for university students, in particular Black young students at the university, to say that we're going to advocate for our identity and not compromise on it, has had a wide-ranging, self-propagating impact across the country. Where discourse around race in the country, in South Africa, with all our history of apartheid, is now fundamentally changed, right? The default position is not the rainbow nation anymore, that everyone should come together because it's a nice thing to do. This is not to say that we've now retreated to racial or ethnic little enclaves, but it's the decision of when we are discussing what it means to be a young Black individual in society, right? We're not starting from the position of compromise. So when I think about the conversation around decolonization of curriculum, I have now seen the impact that it can have on national discourse and changing national discourse. I've also seen the dangers of it, right? The haphazard use of decolonization to fight particular myopic agendas of sorts, right? But there's energy and usefulness in it. So I want to talk about two major things, and then I'll give like quick recommendations from my experience, right? And the two major things when it comes to thinking about decolonization in higher education is don't complicate it. Don't complicate the argument. It's an argument around academic freedom, old age argument. There's nothing fundamentally new about it. It is an argument to say that we want to be able to explore all forms of knowledge because it is a public good to do so. And the argument around academic freedom, at least in South Africa, and there's nuanced differences between countries, that academic freedom is not an absolute right in South Africa. There's a whole long history you could give about why it's not an absolute right. But academic freedom is considered to be conditional. And it seems to be conditional on two factors. The one is, what are you doing as an academic to speak for the public good, right? The second condition that it follows is, what is your responsibility as an academic towards the broader problems within society, right? And what is your responsibility to take into account the internal circumstances of the university as well? And we do this because there's a whole history around universities propagating particular knowledge forms that really made people less than, right? So I approach the conversation of decolonization as, don't be afraid of producing new knowledge. Don't be afraid of going off and seeking out new knowledge. We're not adding something fundamentally new. What you're asking when you want to say, I want to decolonize a university, is to say, the university has abdicated a responsibility towards academic freedom, and we're just putting you back onto the right path, right? So it's a very interesting, nuanced way to do it, because you kind of cut people at the knee. Because a lot of people think, as the last speaker said, that I just want to bring my monolithic idea of what knowledge should be to replace the old one. A lot of people kind of see it that way. The argument is that it's not about replacing it. It's about how do you allow knowledge to compete, right? And you can't compete if you're not even in the race, right? If you're not researching and producing knowledge on particular cultures that don't fit particular norms and standards of what knowledge looks like, if you don't even allow it to compete, if you vigorously compete and say these ideas can stand on their own merit, then what are you doing as a university? Like, what's your purpose as an institution? And when we posed that question to many universities across the country, and you went into that room with a position of, we're not negotiating this. We are telling you what your responsibility should be. It has a huge cascading effect, right? And one of the later on aspects of it becomes curriculum change. I think it is a disservice to limit the conversation of decolonization to curriculum and how you decolonize the curriculum, because it then strips away the power of what changing power dynamics really looks like in a university. Which brings me to the second point, which is try and avoid doing checkbox exercises. South Africa fell into a bad habit of, if we add more Black people into the room, we have now transformed the university, right? If we add more Black students into the university, we have now done our responsibility to go against the harms and the evils of the apartheid regime. What you ended up finding out is that even though you might have a space where the majority still is Black, all right, a space that used to be predominantly white, The culture was predominantly white, the heritage was predominantly white. Simply adding more black faces didn't change that power dynamic, it didn't change the culture of the institution, right? Adding more numbers can create a tipping point of sorts, right? It can create tipping point dynamics within the system, right? But that tipping point is fundamentally determined by those who sit in power, essentially. So when we think about decolonization, we took a step back and said, is it a checkbox exercise or is it a reordering of power dynamics? And we approached this question in various different ways. One was particularly crude, right? A very crude way was when the vice chancellor of the university speaks to us, or the head of the university, that person has to sit on the floor. There's no chairs in the space, right? You sit on the floor and you listen to us. It is a way of physically demonstrating the change of power dynamics. Super crude, I'm not gonna lie to you, but it was highly effective in ensuring that not student leaders feel comfortable in speaking, but the ordinary student who doesn't feel comfortable in speaking in a university, that they don't feel like they are present, seen, observed with their identities and acknowledged, that they believe that the power dynamics are different so they can speak, right? So these crude ways of doing it. And then these nuanced ways of doing it, of saying that the conversation is not just about what curriculum we add, it's a conversation of what is seen as the ideal form of knowledge and what is seen as non-ideal. And the question is, who determined what is non-ideal, right? Who determined what is the vetch of society, if we had to use that particular terminology, right? And how do we have an honest conversation of saying, it is not about replacing or determining that the non-ideal is now ideal, but it's eliminating that continuum. You're eliminating the ideal that you move from a particular position as a young black student, a young underprivileged individual, and you follow this journey in university to become the ideal citizen of the country, right? If you had no say of what that ideal is, we have no interest in participating in that game. It became very interesting in how that evoked itself in universities. The other one is around decoloniality. And the one aspect that a lot of people kind of forget is that colonialism, in its formal sense, has ended. But coloniality exists, right? Colonial relations and the history of colonialism that perpetrates throughout society. But the thing that people miss is how coloniality, this ongoing impact of colonialism, isn't a stagnant concept. It evolves and it changes. It has been evolving and changing over the last 3 centuries of sorts, right? Since the 1600s or so, right? It evolves and adapts and it gets better at creating an other. And in a space such as a university, where one of its primary goals is knowledge production, the question then becomes, what is the responsibility for the university to not just acknowledge the evolving nature of colonial relations? Colonial relations now don't look the same way they looked 60 years ago, right? They still exist, they just don't look the same way. So what's your responsibility to highlight that evolving change and then combat it with your own evolving techniques? In a day and age where we can have this conversation where I'm sitting in Johannesburg and this conference is happening in Birmingham, that was impossible during the decolonial period of the 1960s, 1970s. But imagine it wasn't. Imagine advocates, imagine Julius Nyerere could sit in the same room with Thomas Sankara at any drop of the dime moment, right? To plan and plot and think about how we strategize in combating these things. Technology has allowed us to evolve the ways that we challenge notions of power as well. And I think it's underappreciated. The last thing I'll say, and this is more of the boring thing, so I apologize for the boring aspect of the approaches to change. There's 3 dominant ways you can think about decolonization. I think it becomes particularly important for those involved in the media when you're trying to cover this. Decolonizing the curriculum is such a tiny bit of the story, it's insulting to elevate it as the entire story, right? The 3 ways you can approach it is the ontological experience. So student experiences on campus, as well as academic experiences on campus. It is not just the students who are going through this change. To tell someone who's been a professor for the last 30 years teaching in the exact same way that all of a sudden they must change the way that they teach, the way that they research, the way that they have formulate their identity because I said so is usually frowned upon. And you have to acknowledge that people who are in power, even if they never ask for that power, don't willingly give up that power, right? So there's always going to be a conflict, right? So you need to understand the academic experiences and student experiences. Then you get the epistemological approach, which is how is knowledge produced in the university? Why is it produced? How is it produced? And those are the questions you need to investigate to figure out how particular sets of knowledge production or power structures self-propagate again. And investigating university procedures. In South Africa, there's this thing called standing orders. I'm not sure if the University of Birmingham has it, but it's like university policies that guide all decisions. If you look into the meat of standing orders, you figure out how oppression exists and why it self-perpetuates without anyone actually trying to do it. And then the last thing is look at research activities and ask the tough questions of what are the research activities of the university. It's not to say that you must now no longer do genome sequencing. Right? Once a student said science must fall is a decolonial ideal. No, it's not, right? It's a ridiculous ideal. But the question is, what forms of knowledge are being produced? Where is it being produced? Where are the research activities taking place? There was the previous comment in the last panel, and I promised, Chair, that this is the last thing I'll say. There was a question around, if you add non-English speaking countries to the Commonwealth, how do you just kind of handle that? You handle it, right? That's what you do. And you make a plan, because the only way that you can make changes when you feel uncomfortable about what that change looks like. If you never feel uncomfortable at the change that you're trying to make, if you don't make the person in power uncomfortable, are you really actually changing anything, right? So when you're looking at the research activities, you ask the tough questions of where research activity is being directed, where they're emanating from, where's the money coming from, where's the grant money coming from, are you disseminating it to the right academics? Why does the same emeritus professor keep getting the exact same amount of tons of funding all the time, but their research isn't producing anything new? And that's the question of decolonization. And then you get to curriculum. And I'll end it off there and see if there's any questions, but that's my final point. And I'm sorry about the light. You've just caught me at the end of the day and there's nothing I can do about it. I apologize.
No, that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much. I totally apologize for mispronouncing your name. I thought the story that you gave at the beginning is very telling and means a lot. I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Elaine Unterhalter. We're very happy to have you join us here today.
Thanks very much for the invitation. And I'm afraid this is going to be a slightly dry academic presentation on building on the two very impassioned, politically formulated presentations of the other panelists. But I do want to start by saying that I'm a migrated South African, so I come from the university. I had my undergraduate education at the University of the Witwatersrand, and one of the reasons I was able to come to the UK as an anti-apartheid activist in the 1970s was along routes of migration associated with that kind of complicated Commonwealth politics about opposing apartheid, and that inclusiveness of activists into different Commonwealth countries, I think and the impacts of that on higher education is a story that I think needs to be told and is part of the decolonial threads that are being raised about knowledge production. So I wanted to focus this discussion on risk and excitement, as those are the themes of the conference. And I wanted to link it with the question of higher education and inequalities. And I wanted to start off with a problem that was posed to me by a student last week who lives in a Commonwealth country and where he described that new oil fields have been discovered and resource extraction with considerable environmental degradation is taking place. And the government has promised that the revenues generated will fund a huge expansion of free higher education and bring in many excluded minorities. So that there's the risk of increasing carbon emissions and people dispossessed of their land and livelihood is being traded off against inclusion. And I think this is a real problem for us to think through in the higher education sector. Does that kind of expansion represent decolonisation and enhanced conditions for access and gender equality? And what's going to guide the assessment? Because I think the points that have been made about the different forms of decolonisation, and I think that was a very astute presentation of them. But there are a number of other issues about how we navigate difficulty, and it's that I wanted to counterpose. And I think the problem in higher education is that there are actually two ideas of the university that are bumping up against each other and seem to be in real tension. The one is about a national and local vision of the university that's intending to associated with the development of economic growth, professional service, building of national institutions, including those associated with research and in dialogue with various media. Or there's another vision of the university that's very global. It's associated with the flow of ideas, knowledge, people, skills, and money, and different forms of capital, and it's that kind of idea that's often associated with the Commonwealth or other global formations. And often these two visions are in tension. And I wanted to kind of suggest very, very tentatively from some of the work I've done, how we might navigate those tensions. In 2011, I co-edited a book on global inequalities in higher education because the kinds of aspects of decolonisation that others on this panel have spoken about are themselves products of the enormous inequalities in higher education, just as they're the product of enormous inequalities in education. And we spoke in that book about in quite a hopeful way about higher education as being a place in which we could navigate not just what we called a dilemma, but a tetralemma. It was higher education, we said, could hold together these four different poles of economic growth, sustainability, equity, and democracy. And I've just written with my co-editor from that book, Vincent Carpentier, a assessment of 10 years on. Do we think higher education is still this hopeful place that we can hold together and navigate the tetralemma? We've had a decade of the most terrible wars in Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Syria. The kind of upheavals of climate change are absolutely terrible and engulfing. And universities have not, in any sustained or systematic way, stood up and held governments and corporations to account for economic disjuncture and climate change. There have been small initiatives that some of the science that has helped us navigate through pandemics has been published. But universities, I feel, have not taken the leadership role that they should. And so I feel that there's a huge challenge that has to be met through teaching, learning, and research. because there's something very significant about the space of the higher education sector. I still remain hopeful about what it can do, but I think it's not stepping up enough to the challenge. There are a whole set of issues about conditions inside and outside universities that need to be addressed and need to help us address the themes the tetralemma highlights. These include access, gender, and intersecting inequalities and decolonisation. A transnational and an open idea of university must continue to facilitate these processes. But refinement and attention to historical and contemporary injustices, which take local and national form, and it will be different in different settings, are needed. And this entails close attention to the exchange of ideas, issues of access and participation, attention to the difference of location in dialogues and understanding of the judgments made with regard to quality, solidarity, and social justice. Publicness and public good, which are important values in higher education, are also enmeshed with processes of power, which need critical examination and review, not just simple assertion. So UNESCO attempts to, in a recent report last year, to imagine a new social contract for education. And it says that universities can make significant contributions to broadening the knowledge commons and ensuring its inclusiveness and diversity. But this requires inter-university cooperation, better articulation with education and information systems and the societies they serve, and generating new ideas about the people and politics needed to realize this. It is a process of reimagining, and I don't think it's going deep enough. That process situates higher education as neither a leader nor a follower in grand political designs or in service to particular forms of the state, but it asserts something about an organizational form that is distinctive amongst equals, a distinction that is earned and protected by institutional forms and the connected systems because of what is valuable, but it's always under review. So I want to suggest that it's an acknowledgement not of the power of higher education, universality or rationality, but actually an acceptance of fragility, the vulnerability of humans and the institutions they have built, including higher education institutions, and the need for social solidarity oriented around human rights, equalities, intersectionality, and sustainability. And I think that's the challenge. And I don't know that, and it's a challenge we have to step up to. It's an open question whether the higher education systems and institutions and organizations we have built will take the challenge, and that the people who work in them and the students who study on them can be supported in trying to do that. So I'm sorry to end on the inflection note of a question mark. It's a question mark that I guess is part of the debate about the Commonwealth. And it's that we need to give substance to through reimagining higher education. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. There's lots of food for thought there. So I would like to, oops, sorry, my timer. There we go. So you were spot on time, Elaine. I would like to open the floor to questions. We only have about 5 minutes left. I'm hoping we can maybe go 5 to 10 minutes since the panel before us overran a little bit. Would that be all right? Or? Okay, so 5 minutes for questions. So let me open the floor to any questions, please. Yes. Oh, you have a mic there.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. I'm just wondering then what each of the panellists think about the role of the Commonwealth in that, obviously coming with the history that it does have and the evolution that we've talked about earlier on. In terms of dealing with some of the issues that you articulated, what would your vision be, action points for the Commonwealth moving forward to try to address some of the issues that you've kind of talked about, each of you in each of your 3 presentations? What would your recommendations be for the organisation at large?
Wonderful. So how might the Commonwealth take on board some of the recommendations that have been made by the three panelists on diversifying, decolonizing, and making higher education more inclusive? Is there another question? We can take two at a time, perhaps, or three? No? So, Sunder, would you like to kick off on that question?
I don't think the Commonwealth as an institution can add a great deal to this. It doesn't have the resources and the capacity. What the Commonwealth does have, it's the frame for this conversation and all of the living links within the Commonwealth. If you went into any school in Birmingham and you asked how is this classroom linked to the Commonwealth and what can the schools across the Commonwealth or the universities across the Commonwealth or the businesses across the Commonwealth do to have that conversation about why do we have the links that we have and the relationships that we have. So I think the organisation, it could do some convening, and some convening can happen when it's meeting, but there are so many links in and around the Commonwealth because of the history of the Commonwealth. There's a lot more capacity outside of it formally than within it, but it is in a fact, if you did this well, you would understand what the Commonwealth was, and then you might have a more powerful institution at the end of it that could do more about it as well.
And Professor Chikane? Are you, go ahead.
Yeah. I think from a South African perspective, the Commonwealth doesn't really mean anything, to be completely honest. It's there. It exists, people acknowledge it, and we're very happy to participate in the Commonwealth Games. But outside of that, it's a meaningless institution to the South African experience, right? So my quick answer would be just abolish it and start something new. And not as a flippant response of just burn it all down, but to see the potential of what comes out of something new, a renegotiation of the power dynamics within it, a more open conversation about the historical aspects that inform the formulation of the Commonwealth and what that means about building a new vision of a future, and what its responsibility can be going forward. And I think you don't have to burn it down to do that, but it's just really hard to do incremental reform that creates structural change. So that would be my quick answer. If you want incremental change, keep the Commonwealth, live your best life. But if you really want structural change in society, then you have to kind of burn that down and start again with something new.
Thank you. And Elaine?
Wow, it's so challenging to come after these powerful interventions. Of course, I have this politics of standing in the middle, so I can see both points. That's always, the fence is always quite a painful place to sit. I think that one of the key issues, and we need to talk about it, is how those two threads are woven together. The thread of inclusion and the building of inclusive schools in Birmingham is based on the resource extraction and the unjust economic relations between the global north and the global south. And we've got to name that, we've got to say that, and we've got to find a process of moving from that. So so I guess my politics is always one of, we must talk, and out of talk something else will come. But it's both talk and listening, I guess, that's incredibly important, and listening to ideas that are very radical, whether I think is also important. So sorry, that sounds so wet.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think it's really important you brought in the politics and inequalities, especially between the global north and south. So I just wanted to say one very quick thing, which is that decolonizing isn't about replacing one system with another, because once you start doing that, you begin to institutionalize and you're recolonizing. So it's always about having this stance of challenging and integrating voices in a manner that actually brings the voices that are already there that have been silenced into the debates and the challenges and the criticisms, because those voices are there, they are out there challenging. We just don't necessarily study them on the university curriculum with regards to the production of knowledge. So there are all of these wonderful strands to bring together, and I'd like to thank our three panelists for covering all of these strands, because it's such a vast topic really well. So thank you very much.